we've seen how our inability to adequately address all of the different needs of housing in our communities, affordable housing, senior housing, housing for millennials who want to move back into the region, housing adequate for the essential workers and working families who are the engine that have always made Westchester run, housing for those with disabilities, and yes, even market-rate housing in thriving downtown centers makes all of our other fights and debates around existing apartments, co-ops, rent stabilization, and on that much more contentious. We've also seen how it makes so many other issues that Westchester residents care so deeply about that much harder to solve. Having our towns and villages default to single-family housing for most of their land use, the least energy efficient and least climate-friendly source of housing, makes it that much harder to deal with the buildings that make up almost 40% of our carbon emissions. Similarly, the local processes, land use boards, and decision-making in some communities reflects assumptions that haven't been re-examined for decades. Sometimes they're simply out of date. Other times they're continuing to do exactly what they were designed to do: limit the amount of available housing in Westchester and make it harder for future neighbors, particularly people of color, to move in.
While 40% of Westchester residents are housing burdened, 60% of the nonprofit workforce is housing burdened, and that percentage rises to 70% for direct care staff, primarily people of color and women. The nonprofit workforce cannot live where they work. The stagnation of multifamily housing development due to outdated zoning practices are a root cause of many of the issues we are dealing with today. We can do better. The Welcome Home Westchester campaign can make a long-term difference.
So several years ago, the Westchester County Association identified affordable housing as a serious impediment to smart economic growth in the region. Local businesses that required skilled workers and a stable workforce struggle to fill jobs when workers cannot afford to live where they work. A community may experience a depleted hiring pool if housing prices are too high, starving local businesses of workers or forcing those businesses to pay higher salaries to subsidize commuting costs. Our businesses also suffer when workers are forced to look elsewhere for housing and employment. The Westchester County Association remains focused on the issue, conducting roundtables and information sessions, advocating at public hearings, supporting local projects, and last year adding a brand new chapter to our policy playbook that shows local decision makers how affordable housing can work in and for their communities.
As many know, there's a very long history of municipalities using local land use regulation and zoning ordinances to limit housing supply for certain communities, particularly African American and Latino communities. Due to exclusionary zoning, the percentage of people of color living in high poverty areas is far higher than the rest of the population, which has a detrimental effect on the education and life trajectory of our children. The major cause of this concentration of poverty is the lack of affordable housing due to local land use regulation. The result: exclusion, generational poverty, downward mobility, housing instability, and lack of economic opportunity.